Oh my goodness, cholesterol. Let's talk about it. I'll see you inside. So, what actually is cholesterol? The best way to actually think of cholesterol is actually kind of like a wax. And if you think about wax, you can actually mold it and shape it however you would like, and sometimes it has the tendency to stick to things. And if we look at cholesterol, cholesterol is actually what's called non-water soluble. And you can see this if you've ever mixed fats and oils together, the water will actually sink to the bottom and the oils will float on top of the water. And the reason I'm telling you this is because there aren't just molecules of cholesterol floating inside of our bloodstream. Since the majority of our bloodstream is actually made up of water, cholesterol itself can't just freely float inside the bloodstream. But the body has this beautiful ability to actually package cholesterol into what are called lipoproteins, and you've probably heard of these lipoproteins. These include LDL, HDL, and a few other lipoproteins that we'll talk about. And this also means that if there's a lot of cholesterol inside of the cell can't simply just throw it into the bloodstream to get rid of it because it will be pushed directly back into the cell. You can think of cholesterol as a floaty inside of a pool. When you throw a floaty into a pool, the floaty will stay on the top of the water, and for lack of a better word, this floaty is non-soluble in water. But if you really wanted to, you could grab the floaty and drag it down to the bottom of the pool with you. And while this analogy is a little bit shaky, you would be functioning as the lipoprotein, and the floaty would be functioning as the cholesterol. And it's a little bit different because the lipoprotein actually surrounds the entire molecule of cholesterol, so this cholesterol will be encased inside of these proteins. And this is simply called cholesterol transport, and this is the process of moving cholesterol around from different tissues inside of the body for it to either be used or to be excreted. And now what's super interesting is that every single cell in your body actually has the ability to create cholesterol. So even if you didn't eat a gram of cholesterol, your body would actually synthesize all the cholesterol it needed as long as it had the correct substrate. And what's so beautiful about your body is that the more cholesterol it actually absorbs from your food, the less it will begin to make. And conversely, the less cholesterol that is absorbed from your food, the more it will begin to create. It's estimated that between 80 and 85% of the cholesterol inside of your body, specifically inside of your cells, is actually created by the body and not coming from the cholesterol in your diet. But oftentimes, when cholesterol is synthesized inside of a cell, it's used directly inside of that cell. So if we're thinking about transporting cholesterol, this is actually typically going to be coming from the food that we're ingesting. And for that reason, if we're really going to talk about cholesterol, we're going to actually have to start inside of the mouth. So the food that you eat, typically the foods that contain a lot of fat, will have both cholesterol and triglycerides. Triglycerides are actually the way that nature and our body store fat. So when your fat cells begin to expand, it's because we're putting more triglycerides into the cells. And important to today's topic, cholesterol is actually what makes all of these membranes functional. Another thing that cholesterol can do is actually reduce the amount of damage that occurs from what are called reactive oxygen species. In the same way that you take antioxidants to try and reduce inflammation, cholesterol can actually act as its own antioxidant. And the thing that antioxidants are trying to actually protect us from are these little reactive oxygen species that are produced by normal metabolism. This is simply when we don't metabolize our food exactly perfectly, and we may produce some molecules that we didn't intend to. Because unfortunately, the amount of machinery inside of our body is absolutely mind-blowing. God knows what the actual number is, but it's estimated that there's some 37 trillion cells inside of your body. And since we're creating energy every single second of every single day inside of most of these cells, we simply just make some mistakes every once in a while. It's actually thought that one of the reasons that we age is because of a buildup of these reactive oxygen species that cause micro damage to all of the cells inside of our body on a daily basis, simply just because of our normal metabolism. And the one thing that cholesterol can do is simply just reduce the amount of this damage that actually occurs. And now, see, I really hope to touch on this a little bit later, but this is actually one of the reasons that we find cholesterol in damaged tissues. Cholesterol itself is actually part of the repair process. But in the case of something like heart disease, where we may have a buildup of cholesterol, it is simply that the cholesterol provided the repair, but it was never removed. but I'm getting slightly off topic. Let's get back to cholesterol in the food that you eat. So the process of digestion and absorption actually begins inside of our mouth because there are enzymes inside of our saliva that will begin breaking down different molecules of food immediately when they enter our mouth. And this is so that we can partially digest them so they can better move down the esophagus into our digestive tract. And now, fat molecules in the food that we eat are going to be made up of cholesterol and triglycerides. And what these enzymes are going to do is actually break down the triglycerides and free up the cholesterol. And the way that it breaks the triglycerides is kind of interesting. It actually breaks them down just enough so that they can be digested and absorbed and then reformed into triglycerides for storage. And a triglyceride is simply three fatty acids attached to one molecule of glycerol. And what these enzymes will do is actually turn a triglyceride into two free fatty acids and a monoglycerol. A monoglycerol is simply just one glycerol with one fatty acid attached. And free fatty acids are simply just fatty acids that aren't attached to a glycerol molecule. And it will also help to free up the cholesterol inside of the food that we eat. Anything that's called free, like free fatty acids or free cholesterol, simply just means that it's not attached to anything. So interestingly, we don't actually digest much fat inside of the stomach because the stomach is very acidic and it's used to digest and break down protein. The stomach will contribute a small bit by simply just doing what's called churning, and this is really just mechanically breaking down different molecules of food. And luckily for us, because of how acidic it is, it actually will kill off any bacteria that has grown on the food that we eat. And I know that sounds crazy, but every single piece of food that you put in your mouth has some sort of bacteria on it. But that's an entirely separate topic. So fat digestion and cholesterol digestion and absorption will actually occur in the small intestine, where we have more of these lipase enzymes in order to completely break down the fats in the food that we eat. And your small intestine is actually going to be that area that you typically refer to as your stomach, right around your belly button. And now one very important thing is that fat and cholesterol is what's called hydrophobic, which means it's going to float in water. So in order to go anywhere inside of the bloodstream, it's going to need to be carried by something that is able to mix inside of water. So through the process of digestion, we're going to have a lot of these monoglycerol, free fatty acids, and free cholesterol. And it gets broken down in a few different stages, and it eventually gets packaged up into what's called a micelle. And you can think of a micelle like a lipoprotein like LDL, where it's going to carry all of this fat and cholesterol throughout the bloodstream. And in this scenario, it's actually going to carry it to the liver. And what the liver is going to do is it's actually going to repackage all of these monoglycerides and fatty acids back up into triglycerides. And it's going to package all of this up into what's referred to as a chylomicron. A chylomicron is going to be this big molecule that has a bunch of triglycerides and cholesterol inside of it. And right when you eat something containing fat and cholesterol, your body will create these chylomicrons and send them directly to the muscle tissue and the fat tissue. And this is actually referred to as first pass metabolism. This means that the muscle tissue and the fat tissue are actually going to be the first tissues that have any access to ingested fat and cholesterol. But what's pretty interesting is that when it's created inside of the liver, on its surface it has a specific protein called ApoB48. But when it gets into the bloodstream, it's going to interact with a molecule called HDL. The full name for this molecule is called high-density lipoprotein, and I'm sure you've heard this molecule referred to as the good cholesterol. The first mistake is that HDL cholesterol is not actually a real thing. HDL is actually a lipoprotein that contains cholesterol. You see, HDL cholesterol and LDL cholesterol contain the exact same cholesterol. The difference is going to be the membrane, specifically the proteins inside of the membrane that surround the cholesterol. You can think of it kind of like shipping a shirt in either a bag or a box. It's still the same shirt, and in this case, the shirt is the cholesterol. The only thing that's different is what it's packaged in. So what this HDL molecule is going to do is it's actually going to take two different proteins and transfer it onto our chylomicron. And the only aggravating part about this is that after reviewing a ton of different publications and textbooks, I still can't tell you exactly what the signaling or transfer process looks like. Everything that I have read simply just says HDL transfers two of these lipoproteins onto chylomicrons. And these lipoproteins are ApoC2 and ApoE. And I wish I could provide you with the exact process that transpires, but all that really is important is that HDL adds ApoC2 and ApoE onto this chylomicron. So now we have a chylomicron inside the bloodstream with lots of triglycerides and cholesterol, and in its membrane it has three proteins, ApoC2, ApoE, and ApoB48. And now what happens is that on the muscle and the adipose tissue, there's a specific enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And this enzyme will simply just take the triglycerides that are stored in the chylomicron and chop them up into free fatty acids and glycerol. And triglycerides make up about 85% of the content of a chylomicron. So these tissues will have a lot of triglycerides at their disposal. And now the skeletal muscle will typically use these free fatty acids for energy. However, we do have what are called intramuscular triglycerides. And this topic is kind of complex because exercise in a healthy person can increase the storage of intramuscular triglycerides. And this is actually useful for producing energy during exercise. With that being said, if you begin to develop diabetes and obesity, you'll actually begin to store more intramuscular triglycerides, but these become dysfunctional. And to put some numbers on it, there's about 10 grams of intramuscular triglycerides per pound of muscle. So it's not an entirely massive amount, but it could contribute to storing fat somewhere that isn't your adipose tissue. It's very similar to the way that your muscle tissue will store glucose as glycogen. We can store glycogen inside the muscle and break it down into glucose during exercise. In the same way, we can store triglycerides inside of a muscle and break it down into free fatty acids during exercise. And then in the adipose tissue, these free fatty acids from the chylomicron can simply just be stored as triglycerides inside of body fat. And there is one really interesting thing I found doing all of this research, and I actually had no idea that this was the case, so I just wanted to mention it. So we actually require glucose in order to store body fat. And now this doesn't mean we should never eat carbohydrates because at some point the body will just make the glucose on its own so we can store body fat. However, we store fatty acids as triglycerides, but glycerol inside of our bloodstream can't actually enter into our cells, meaning the only thing that can actually enter is fatty acids. But then the cell will uptake glucose, which it can turn into glycerol for the glycerol backbone of triglycerides. And this is actually an insulin-dependent process. And one of the things that occurs during type 1 diabetes when someone doesn't produce any insulin is actually almost an inability to store body fat. And while there are definitely other reasons for this, one of the reasons is that they can't actually get the glucose inside of the cell because this is typically an insulin-dependent process. With that being said, if you listen to my nutrient timing episode, which I really think you should go listen to, we do actually have the ability to get glucose inside of a cell through, are you ready for this? It's called non-insulin dependent GLUT4 translocation. And that's just a really complex way of saying that when we contract our muscles during exercise, the cells will actually allow these glucose channels that transport glucose from the bloodstream into the cell to go to the membrane of the cell so now we can intake more glucose. So the reason that cells aren't constantly taking all of the glucose out of our bloodstream is because there are specific channels that need to be present on the membrane for glucose to actually enter. And these channels sit inside of our cells and kind of just lay there dormant. And one of the functions of insulin is to cause these cells to go through what's called translocation, which is simply just moving from inside of the cell and docking onto the membrane so now glucose can enter. And non-insulin dependent translocation is simply when we do this without insulin using muscle contractions. And when we do this, the channels will dock into the membrane and allowing glucose, which is actually one of the reasons why for type 1 diabetics, if they're having an inability to get their blood glucose levels down, doing some sort of physical activity can be extremely beneficial. With that being said, all of this is a matter of my opinion and should not be misconstrued as medical advice. So I guess the takeaway from that rant is that body fat storage is kind of an insulin dependent process, so this may just be another reason why you wouldn't want to have a meal that's abundant in both carbohydrates and fat. It may be better to do either just fat and protein or just carbohydrate and protein, but this is kind of a very minute detail that won't have a drastic effect. Oh yeah, we were talking about chylomicrons. So chylomicrons have what is referred to as a short resonance time, and a resonance time is just the amount of time that they spend in the bloodstream. And after a meal, chylomicrons will be almost completely cleared from your bloodstream within about 1 to 2 hours. So the function of this molecule is to bind onto the lipoprotein lipase on adipose tissue and skeletal muscle, release the stored triglycerides, and then the fatty acids are just uptaken by these tissues. And this actually occurs through the binding to lipoprotein lipase of that ApoC2 protein that was just handed to us nicely by HDL. And the chylomicron returns the favor and hands this protein right on back to HDL once it's done. And what I mean by done is that once it has released most of its stored triglycerides. So now we're left with a particle that doesn't have much triglycerides in it, has a good amount of cholesterol in it, and has two proteins on its membrane, ApoB48 and ApoE. And this is actually referred to as a chylomicron remnant. And that ApoE molecule is pretty important because it actually will bind to what's called the LDL receptor or the LDL related protein receptor that's located on the liver. And the liver will actually uptake this particle and simply just break it down into all of its parts. So it will basically digest this molecule into the free fatty acids and glycerol from the triglycerides, the amino acids from the proteins in the membrane, and then the free cholesterol from all of the stored cholesterol in the molecule. And the liver can use all of these for various functions, and then when it needs to actually transport more triglycerides and more cholesterol in the bloodstream, it can repackage all of these components into what is called a very low density lipoprotein. And before we really get into this, I just want to get a little bit of nomenclature out of the way. So, the density of a lipoprotein simply just means its size. The lower the density, the larger its size, and the higher its density, the smaller it is. So a very low density lipoprotein is actually the least dense lipoprotein, and this is because it has the most amount of stored triglycerides. And it functions exactly like a chylomicron, except the only difference is that ApoB protein is now called ApoB100 instead of ApoB48. And the only reason this could be kind of important is if you have a blood test that can test ApoB48 and ApoB100, you would know that the ApoB48 molecules are coming from chylomicrons, which simply just means that it's coming from the food that you eat. And if they test for these proteins, the ApoB48 number would actually increase after a meal, but should be almost absent 2 to 3 hours after a meal. And any molecule containing ApoB100 was created in the liver for the purpose of cholesterol and triglyceride transportation. So if there's a good amount of cholesterol and triglycerides in the liver, and there are tissues that actually need these molecules, the liver will package it up into a VLDL the same way that it created a chylomicron. And it exits the liver with this ApoB100 molecule, lots of triglycerides, and lots of cholesterol. And it interacts with HDL the exact same way and gains this ApoC2 and ApoE molecule. And just like the chylomicron, it will interact with the lipoprotein lipase through the binding of ApoC2 to lipoprotein lipase. And if we remember what this enzyme does, it breaks down all of the stored triglycerides, releases free fatty acids into the bloodstream, and these free fatty acids are quickly taken up by different tissues that need them, specifically the adipose tissue and the muscle tissue. And the VLDL is just as nice, and it hands this ApoC2 right on back to HDL. So we have another molecule that's very similar to that chylomicron remnant. It doesn't have that much triglycerides. It has an ApoE and an ApoB100 in its membrane. And this molecule is actually referred to as an IDL, or an intermediate density lipoprotein. And the reason it has an intermediate density and not a very low density is because it has lost size because it has lost stored triglycerides. So you can think of a VLDL as almost the exact same function as a chylomicron, except instead of going up in our bloodstream when we are eating, VLDL will probably actually increase when we are in a fasted state and the liver is trying to transport triglycerides and cholesterol to the tissues that need it. And now VLDLs typically have a pretty short resonance time of about 4 to 6 hours, and an IDL will typically just go right on to the liver and be broken down the same way that the chylomicron remnant was. And then we move on to the next molecule, which is LDL. And now a lot of LDL is actually synthesized directly inside of the liver. However, if we remove enough of the triglycerides, once we lose the ApoC2 molecule, it can actually be referred to as an LDL molecule if it is small enough. So IDLs really aren't something that stick around in our body for far that long. LDL, on the other hand, has a resonance time of between 3 and 5 days. And now what are the actual functions of LDL? Well, VLDL really is used to carry around triglycerides, but LDL is going to be a lot less dense than VLDL, meaning it doesn't have very much triglycerides. But as you may remember, there's an abundant amount of cholesterol inside of this LDL molecule. And LDL actually has a receptor on cells called the LDL receptor. And unlike VLDL, LDL is actually taken directly into the cell, where the cell will actually degrade the particle and use the stored cholesterol. And this cholesterol, once again, is vital for the functioning of all of our cells. If we look at cholesterol inside of the skin, it is used to produce vitamin D. Cholesterol can be uptaken into the adrenal gland, where it's used to make things like testosterone and estrogen, cortisol, aldosterone. And now what actually regulates how many of these LDL receptors are available on the cell for the LDL to bind to? Because one of the issues that we run into with LDL inside of our bloodstream is simply just not taking it up at a high enough rate inside of the cells. So luckily, cholesterol itself actually has a feedback mechanism where if cholesterol inside of the cell begins to get low, the cell will actually cause what's called transcription, which is simply just making new proteins, and this protein is actually the specific LDL receptor. So when we have low cholesterol levels, this protein is active and it will bind to the DNA and cause the transcription of the LDL receptor. But cholesterol itself can actually inhibit this protein from going and binding to the DNA and causing this transcription, which would reduce the amount of LDL receptors we have available. So if the cell has already uptaken a lot of cholesterol, or it's already created a lot of cholesterol, we'll actually reduce the amount of LDL receptors that are available so we won't keep taking up more cholesterol into the cell. So if the cholesterol inside of the cell is sufficient, the cell actually kind of begins to become cholesterol resistant. And this can include cells like the liver, the muscle tissue, and the adipose tissue. And now, interestingly, the brain actually makes all of its own cholesterol because cholesterol inside of the brain is so important that it is extremely tightly regulated by endogenous or production inside of the brain, so that whatever is going on inside of our bloodstream simply does not affect the cholesterol inside of our brain. And now, when we actually activate the LDL receptor to be transcribed, will also cause the transcription of a different molecule called HMG-CoA reductase. And typically, we actually have lower levels of this enzyme inside of the cell, and it is what limits the cell from further creating cholesterol. And once again, this is inhibited by having high amounts of cholesterol inside of the cell. So when cholesterol levels inside of the cell begin to fall and reduce, this transcription factor is once again able to function because it is no longer being inhibited by cholesterol. And we will begin to transcribe the pieces of the DNA that are meant for the creation of HMG-CoA reductase. And this is referred to as the rate-limiting enzyme in cholesterol synthesis, meaning that the reason that we may not go through the process of creating cholesterol is because we don't have enough of this specific enzyme. Because when we get very high cholesterols inside of the cell has two mechanisms to reduce the amount of cholesterol. Once again, the first one was to stop the production of the LDL receptor so we don't continue to uptake cholesterol into the cell. And the second is to inhibit the production of this enzyme so we don't have the enzymes required to create more cholesterol. And there's actually one other what's called intracellular mechanism, which is simply just a mechanism that occurs inside of a cell. And this is actually referred to as ubiquitination. And this is simply just a process of taking proteins that have already been created, such as this HMG-CoA reductase enzyme or the LDL receptor. So the way that this process really occurs is that on proteins that we don't want inside of the cell anymore, we'll actually add what's called a ubiquitin molecule. And this ubiquitin molecule actually allows it to interact with what's called the proteasome, which is kind of like a trash man inside of the cell that is constantly digesting proteins that we do not want anymore. And this works to remove and recycle any damaged or unwanted proteins inside of the cell. Once again, cholesterol inside of the cells is very tightly regulated, and inside of the cell is actually where we want this cholesterol. We also have the ability to create more cholesterol inside of the liver and deliver it to tissues that need it. So in order for us to actually begin creating cholesterol, we actually need some sort of bolus of glucose or fatty acids. So the first step of actually turning both of these molecules into energy is to turn them into what is called acetyl-CoA. And then acetyl-CoA will be used in what's called the Krebs cycle to actually produce ATP, which is the energy we need. But this process can only occur so quickly, and if we have a bolus of glucose or fatty acids inside of the liver, we'll actually begin to accumulate acetyl-CoA that we're not using immediately. But I'm not going to actually list the steps of this process because this process takes about 30 different steps. But once again, inside of the liver, this HMG-CoA reductase enzyme is what's referred to as the rate-limiting enzyme. So if cholesterol levels in the liver are actually low, then we won't have this inhibition of this enzyme and we'll have more of it. And then once cholesterol levels are sufficient, we'll stop creating more cholesterol because it will actually inhibit the production of the enzyme we need to create it. Now let's say we eat a meal containing a massive amount of cholesterol, and we can't actually use all of this cholesterol inside of our cells. Luckily for us, we're not just going to keep creating more lipoproteins and have these floating around in our bloodstream for no reason. There are two different mechanisms that keep our cholesterol levels extremely normal. The first one is we can actually regulate the amount that we absorb in the small intestine. So we create what are called bile acids in order to help us digest fat. And cholesterol is a major component in bile acids. And eventually, these bile acids, if they build up, we'll just get rid of them in our feces. And now the next thing that I think we should talk about is actually HDL, because I didn't actually talk in depth about what HDL is. So obviously we know HDL is extremely nice and it will donate those two proteins to chylomicrons and VLDL particles. So HDL is produced in the liver and it has a specific protein called ApoA1. And with this protein, it can actually bind onto what are called macrophages. And this is why HDL is always promoted as being the good cholesterol, because it can do what's called reverse cholesterol transport. So one of the dangerous things about LDL is that it has the ability to go through what is called oxidation. So if you remember those reactive oxygen species I spoke about earlier, sometimes this can actually damage the LDL particles. And the reason the LDL is so prone to this oxidation is simply because it's inside of the bloodstream for so long. And some of the things that increase our levels of reactive oxygen species would simply be things like exercise, but also some of the foods that we eat, such as oxidized oils. And what happens is when these LDL particles get oxidized, they're taken up by what are called macrophages. And these are just white blood cells that will go around the body and digest different proteins and molecules that aren't behaving as they should be. But the thing is, these macrophages kind of just accumulate these LDL particles, and they accumulate more and more cholesterol inside of them. And when it accumulates all of this cholesterol, it becomes what's called a foam cell. And I will discuss foam cells more in a moment and why these cells are dangerous. Another type of LDL particle it can take up are what are called glycated LDL particles. So one thing that can happen in our bloodstream is that LDL can actually interact with glucose inside of our bloodstream. And this is simply when a molecule of glucose will actually bind to the cholesterol and become what is called an advanced glycation end product. And once again, this LDL becomes dysfunctional and not useful, so the macrophage will uptake the LDL and increase the amount of cholesterol inside of the macrophage. So there are really two fates for the cholesterol inside of this macrophage. The first one is that it can be uptaken by HDL, transported back to the liver, and simply just be recycled. So that very important ApoA1 protein that's only found on HDL, and it can uptake some of the cholesterol, and it can bring it back either to the liver, but I didn't mention it can also bring it to simply just the tissues that need cholesterol, like the muscle and the adipose tissue, and the adrenal cortex to make steroid hormone. And if HDL brings it right on back to the liver and there's just a buildup or an accumulation of cholesterol inside of the liver, then once again this cholesterol is just secreted into the bile. So if we have very high cholesterol levels, HDL is used to either remove them or get the cholesterol into the right places. What's even cooler is HDL can actually give this cholesterol to other lipoproteins like LDL, VLDL, and IDL. And what it does is basically a one-for-one transfer of cholesterol for triglycerides that are stored in these lipoproteins. And there are actually 28 times as many HDL particles inside of our blood as there are LDL. But if you really look at it, HDL and LDL are kind of similar in some of their functions. They both really work to bring cholesterol to tissues that actually need it. And the only reason that LDL becomes dysfunctional is when the particle itself gets damaged. And this is where the idea of, instead of testing LDL particles in the blood, starting to test for the oxidized LDL particles that will be uptaken into macrophages and become useless. With that being said, we can take a look back at what these macrophages will actually do. So LDL particles are actually some of the particles that are used to repair damage in the blood vessels. Because once again, this cholesterol is actually used to repair. But let's say a lot of this LDL is actually oxidized. Let's say there's damage to the lining of the blood vessels. There's this oxidized LDL that will enter the space between the outside and the inside of the blood vessel. There's actually three layers, and the middlemost layer is called the tunica intima. And if there's damage in this area, there will be two different molecules that enter, these macrophages and the oxidized LDL particles. And when the macrophages build up in size because they begin consuming all these oxidized LDL particles, they actually get lodged in this space and they stay there for a while. And now really the one way that cholesterol itself becomes extremely dysfunctional is when it sits there and begins to accumulate, because it will actually begin to crystallize. And we call this process of crystallization in this tunica intima the formation of plaque. And in the body, the way that blood is carried is through these arteries, and when plaque builds up on the space outside of the arteries, it will actually begin to compress the arteries. You can think of the artery being kind of like a hose, and when this plaque begins to build up, it's like pinching part of the hose. What happens is this increases the pressure that's pushing on the hose, and less water ends up actually getting out of the end of the hose. And eventually, if this becomes too tight, then no water, or in this case blood, will be able to flow through at all. And when the artery gets so compressed that no blood is able to get through it, it could cause something like a heart attack or a stroke. And this process you'll often hear referred to as atherosclerosis. So the big thing here is that the reason that LDL particles are associated with this process is because it is the LDL that stays around in the bloodstream long enough to get oxidized and uptaken into these macrophages. However, we first need this oxidation process to occur, which would increase if we are simply inflamed or producing more of these reactive oxygen species. And there are a myriad of things that increases the production of these things, and most of them correlate back to simply just living an unhealthy life. And a major one is actually consuming oxidized oils, which are typically found in foods that are not recommended for health promoting benefits. This includes fast food and most of the packaged foods. And remember, the other thing is these glycated LDL particles, which can occur from having extremely high blood glucose. And to really talk about that, I would love for you to go back and listen to all of the episodes I have on insulin resistance. Because yes, overconsumption of carbohydrates or just food in general will increase our blood glucose levels. But what makes this glucose stick around for too long is when the cells become resistant to insulin and the glucose can't really get inside of the cells. And the glycation process can damage the LDL, and it can also glycate the blood vessels, which causes damage to the blood vessels in the first place, which once again would lead to the process of LDL coming to fix the issue, but if it's oxidized, it could get stuck in this space. And then the other thing that is highly associated with heart disease is actually high blood pressure. And if you think about this, blood pressure is simply just the pressure being pushed outwards on all of the veins and arteries. And the higher this pressure is, just the more likely we are to damage or cause wear and tear on the blood vessels. And they say this is why they often associate stress with heart disease, because stress is actually associated with an increase in blood pressure. But there's one other thing that could really have a big impact on blood pressure, and this is an improper ratio of sodium to potassium. And now I want to reiterate that. It's not sodium itself. It is an improper ratio of sodium to potassium that typically will cause high blood pressure. And the reason for this is because sodium is actually the main electrolyte inside of the bloodstream, and potassium is the main electrolyte inside of our cells. And one thing that's very important is that if we begin to become deficient in potassium, the kidneys will begin to reabsorb sodium in response, which means one of the biggest reasons we'll have too much sodium inside of the bloodstream is not because we're eating too much sodium, but because we're not eating enough potassium. And the only reason sodium is important is because it's the main electrolyte in the bloodstream and in the interstitial space, which is actually the fluid that surrounds all of your cells. And sodium itself is extremely important for things like neurons, muscle contractions, and fluid balance. So if you retain more sodium, it will increase the amount of solutes inside of the bloodstream. And this is important because the body has a specific osmolarity that it tries to maintain. And the osmolarity is simply just the ratio of solutes to liquid inside of the bloodstream and all the compartments of the body. So let's say we maintain a ratio of 90 grams of water for every 10 grams of sodium. If we increase the amount of sodium, then we'll have to increase the amount of water we retain. And since this is occurring inside of the bloodstream, this will increase and expand the amount of blood and increase our blood pressure. But simply just eating potassium will allow the kidneys to excrete some of this extra sodium, and we won't be retaining as much sodium inside of the bloodstream. And typically, if we're eating sufficient sodium and potassium, the kidneys do a great job of simply just excreting any excess. And it really seems that the only time we'll begin to hold on to extra electrolytes, or solutes for that matter, is because we are not getting enough of one of them. And one of the biggest reasons we're having an issue with sodium is because most of the foods that we're eating, if they're processed, are enriched with sodium, and they actually reduce the amount of potassium in some circumstances because potassium actually increases satiety. And this is probably actually just down to the fact that a lot of people are deficient, and fixing a deficiency oftentimes increases your satiety. But we also have a craving for salt and not a craving for potassium. So a lot of foods are enriched with sodium and potassium is neglected, which means we may end up sitting in a state of overabundance of sodium and a deficiency in potassium, which once again causes the kidneys to retain sodium. So simply, we can just increase our potassium intake, such as eating fresh meats, fresh fruits, and fresh vegetables. And this is in no way saying to take a potassium supplement, because that could become dangerous. And the other thing that could actually increase blood pressure is glucose is also a solute in the blood. So if we have extremely high blood glucose, this would increase our blood pressure by pulling water into the bloodstream. And again, to go more in depth in this, I would love you to listen to any of the podcasts on insulin resistance. And remember the fact that exercise itself will reduce our blood glucose through that non-insulin dependent GLUT4 translocation. Sorry, I just really like saying that. So I think the big take-home point is that, once again, LDL is extremely functional. But by simple math, the more LDL inside of the bloodstream, and the longer it stays inside of the bloodstream, the more likely it will be to get oxidized. So we don't want no LDL, because then we won't be able to deliver a lot of this cholesterol to the tissues that need it. And there's really no saying what this could do. But the reason that we would have an accumulation of LDL is typically because it's not interacting with its receptor and not getting into the cells in the first place. And once again, even this technically isn't a bad thing until it gets oxidized and until we get damage of the blood vessels. So to try and bring it full circle and give some sort of take-home advice, I kind of just hope this gave you some insight that LDL actually has a protective function, but the minute it gets oxidized, it begins behaving adversely. So we would want to try and do things like not ingesting foods that have a lot of oxidized products, specifically seed oils and other oils that can become oxidized. One thing that's important to note is the more unsaturated an oil is, the more likely it will be to get oxidized. And also, the longer it is exposed to any sort of light, the increased likelihood it will be to get oxidized. So this would be things like polyunsaturated fatty acids typically, and something like a monounsaturated oil like olive oil that is stored in a very dark container is technically the least likely to get oxidized. But the denser a fat is, such as coconut oil, butter, lard, or tallow, the less unsaturated it is and the less likely it will be to get oxidized. And I think a lot of people really get caught up in the minutia of the exact oils and the exact things that we should be cooking with, but I think it's simply just best to stay away from things we know we probably shouldn't be ingesting, like a lot of fast food that is fried in oil that is extremely oxidized. And in terms of the glucose, we would really just want to try and regulate our glucose levels, probably by sticking to more natural foods that don't come with an abundance of rapidly digestible glucose. And I think the best episode to really understand all of this is the one about GLP-1 and the incretin hormones, and that one is titled, Can You Save $1,200 by Changing Your Diet? But the take-home points from that is to eat foods in their whole form and stick to things like fruits, vegetables, and meats. Once again, I think a lot of times the diet is very overcomplicated and can be simplified into sticking to whole foods that we've been eating for thousands of years. And one big thing that seems to keep coming up is actually increasing potassium intake, which is really easy by just eating a few oranges, some potatoes maybe, and eating fresh meat. So that being said, I think if you have high LDL levels and you know you're living an unhealthy lifestyle, this is something that you'd want to actually monitor. So the first step in all of this is simply just to reduce the amount of stress and the amount of unhealthy lifestyle habits we are engaging in. Alright, I think I'm going to leave this one here. That's really all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for listening. And I hope to see you next episode. Have a great day.